Hello everyone, I'm starting a new series, One Win, One Loss, featuring 2 games I've played that I found interesting. Let's take a look at this first game. I have the white pieces and I start with the pawn to d4. My opponent plays d5 and here I play the queen's gambit c4. The idea is to lure the black pawn away from the center and then recapture the black pawn. For example, if the black pawn takes on c4, you can push the e-pawn to recapture. Sometimes you also have queen checks with qa4 that can create a fork. My opponent plays c6 to reinforce. So what is the plan for white when black doesn't take on c4? Some players will start exchanging or pushing pawns. But if you exchange, you end up equalizing the pawn structure and giving the black knight the c6 square back. It's better to leave the pawn on c6 so the knight doesn't have that square, while the white knight has the c3 square. Some players think you should push to c5. But if you push to c5, it's too early because the pawn is exposed to the b6 lever. If there's a capture, black recaptures, and they're the ones who will have the c5 lever to attack the central pawn. And after b6, you can't reinforce with b4 because of a5. It's impossible to play a3 because of the capture on b4, since recapturing would lose the rook on a1. So if we understand that progress doesn't come from capturing or pushing, then how do we proceed? Well, by central expansion with the e4 push, but it needs to be prepared, which is why we play knight to c3. If black plays, for example, e6, then we're able to play e4. But often black plays knight to f6, of course to protect d5, but also to strengthen control over the e4 square and prevent this e4 push. With white, we play knight to f3, and here black often makes a mistake that my opponent did not make. My opponent played the move pawn to e6, which is the main move. But if black develops the bishop before playing e6, it seems natural to want to bring out the bishop before playing e6, a bit like a London system with reversed colors for those who are familiar. The problem is that there's a concrete line for white that puts black in trouble, which is capturing on d5. And if black recaptures, queen to b3 comes in to attack the b7 pawn, which the bishop no longer protects. Now you might think it's not such a big deal, this b7 pawn can be easily defended. But be careful, because there's also double pressure on d5. So if the black queen comes to c8 or c7, there will be a capture on d5. And if the queen comes to d7, knight to e5 will push the queen back. So often black will play b6, but here there's the push to e4. It's true that if you don't know this line, you're unlikely to find it. But this push to e4 is very strong. It frees the bishop with tempo so it can come to b5. And after the capture, we play knight to e5, threatening mate on f7 with the idea of provoking black to play e6, and now bishop to b5 check. Here we see that the knight didn't just come to attack f7, it came to join the bishop in attacking the king along the diagonal, because after knight to d7, which actually protects the knight, it's not the queen, it's not the king, it's the knight on f6. Faced with this threat, bishop takes. So white will play bishop to g5 to eliminate it, and even if black plays bishop to e7, we take, and afterwards we win the piece. We now understand that developing the bishop to f5 and even developing the bishop to g4 doesn't work. There would be knight to e5 followed by the capture and queen to b3. We see that this doesn't work and that we have to settle for e6. Of course, this does block the bishop, but black has other ideas for developing this bishop, which I'll show you later. And above all, black is now threatening to take on c4 and keep the pawn. Because up until now, white had ways to recover the pawn. But once the moves c6 and e6 have been played, there is a real threat of taking on c4 and holding onto that pawn on c4. So what I usually do here is play e3 to defend the c4 pawn and avoid this problem. But there is another variation, which is to play bishop to g5, continue developing, and ignore the capture on c4. And when black takes on c4, white can't try to recover the pawn. For example, they can't play a4 to try to prevent the b5 push, because bishop to b4 can be played. That's why I told you that we need e6 with black, which pins the knight, threatening b5, and in case of a capture, the pawn can recapture since the knight is pinned. And black even has counterattacks with queen to a5, a double attack on the pinned knight, pressure on the bishop, and sometimes the knight on f6 can come to e4 to attack once the queen has moved to a5. And maybe you've fallen for counterattacks of this kind. So when black takes on c4, you have to give up the idea of playing a4, you need to play e4. You have to put everything on the e5 push. Black consolidates, then e5. It looks like you're winning a piece now, but black is going to counterattack the bishop that's pinning the knight, and after bishop h4, g5. The best line for white is to sacrifice the knight because you'll get back the pinned piece, and often it continues with positions like this, where white will play g3, bishop g2, and castle kingside. Black will play bishop b7, develop the knight, and look to castle queenside. These are very complex positions. But as I told you, in this position, I prefer to play e3 to defend the c4 pawn. Of course, it's true that this blocks in the c1 bishop, but my idea is very simple, to play bishop to d3 and then e4. And nothing will stop me from playing e4 and freeing the c1 bishop afterwards. My opponent plays knight to d7 and I play bishop to d3. And now I have the threat of playing e4, certainly after castling short, but I will have this threat of pushing e4, and that's when black takes on c4. They usually wait until the bishop has developed before taking on c4, to make the bishop lose a tempo instead of taking immediately. So bishop takes, but why do black play this way? You see here, white has a better pawn center. They have the d4 pawn, so black will need to look for the c5 or e5 breaks to attack the d4 pawn. e5 isn't possible because there would be a double capture, which would lose the pawn, but the c5 push is possible. But black usually plays b5 first. Why? That's what happened in the game. My opponent played b5, so I retreated the bishop to d3, and the idea then is to play a6. That's not what my opponent did. I'll show you what happened next. But the idea is to play a6 to protect b5, and then play c5. That way the c-pawn can come and attack white's central pawn. After all, white traded a c4 pawn for a d5 pawn. Well, black will be able to trade a c-pawn for white's d4 pawn. And then, once black has played the c5 pawn, the bishop that we thought would have trouble developing because of the pawn on f6 in the opening will actually regain the long diagonal and be very well placed. So this is the usual sequence, playing a6, c5, or bishop b7, a6, c5 in different move orders. And my opponent is going to choose to play bishop to d6. He prefers to castle. e4 threatens the e5 fork. So here black is forced to block me. So I've already found myself in this type of position when black played e5 and I didn't know how to respond properly. So I had worked a little with the computer and I realized that at a certain point, exchanging the d-pawn for the e-pawn could be favorable for white because it allowed white to have a majority of 4 pawns against only 3 for black on the king side, and therefore 1 extra pawn, the central pawn, which could be used to launch attacks against the black king. Because the black king will almost certainly castle short here. So now I start calculating the capture on e5. I look at taking on e5, knight takes, bishop takes. And in my previous analyses, there was this push to f4. But here, it doesn't work because after the push to f4, even though it might seem interesting, we attack the bishop, we want to play e5 to push back the knight afterwards and gain a space advantage on the king side. But the bishop on d4 will prevent castling. It controls the g1 square. So I realize here that taking on e5 is premature. So I'm going to castle short. If black takes on d4, that's possible, but in that case, the knight recaptures, attacks c6, and will threaten to jump to f5 to attack the bishop and the g7 pawn. My opponent castles short. And now I start thinking again about taking on e5, because now that I've castled, my opponent can't stop me from doing it. But it's still not satisfactory, because after taking on e5, as soon as I play f4, there's bishop to d4 check, the king goes to h1, and then an attack with knight to g4. That's a terrible attack. It threatens knight to f2, the fork supported by the bishop, but also the queen coming to h4 to attack h2. And if I try to play moves like queen to e2 to control the e3 and f2 squares, the squares where the knight can penetrate, there could be queen to h4, but worse, there could be knight takes h2. And I can't recapture because of mate. It's checkmate with the bishop controlling the g1 square. It's terrible. That means in this position, taking on e5 is too premature. So I might want to play h3, because the problem with taking on e5 is that the move knight to g4 will eventually come. But I prefer to play bishop to g5, to pin his knight and develop my pieces. My opponent challenges me with h6. There's no way I'm going to take. Of course, if the knight recaptures, I'm happy. I win the e5 pawn and create a fork. If the black pawn recaptures, I'm happy as well. That breaks the kingside defenses. But my opponent can recapture with the queen and end up with a good position. He keeps control of the e5 pawn and will have the bishop pair. That's not appealing for me. So I play bishop to h4 and maintain the pin. My opponent plays rook to e8, maybe putting pressure on the e-pawn. I prefer to play queen to c2, bishop to b7. And now I start thinking again about capturing on e5. If I take on e5, knight takes, bishop takes f4. Here, I'm not really afraid of bishop to d4 check because I can play king to h1. There's always this threat of e5 with the queen being pinned. But instead of bishop to d4 check, black could play queen to b6 check to get out of the pin. If I go to f2, the bishop comes to d4. And if I go to h1, black can now take on c3. There's no way I can recapture because that would lose the pawn on e4. So I have to recapture with the pawn. But then with the c5 push, the queen defends the knight. If there's a capture, there won't be any need to recapture with the g7 pawn and weaken the king. We can recapture with the queen. And that also frees up the bishop, the knight, and the rook, which attacks e4. Plus there's the threat of the c4 push to attack the bishop on d3. And in the end, the black position is very interesting. So now I understand that every time I push the f-pawn to try to activate my majority on the king side, the problem is the checks along the diagonal. So I play king to h1. And my opponent doesn't realize now that the threat of capturing on e5 is real and plays rook to c8. And so, as you guessed, I take on e5. Knight takes, bishop takes, and then the push f4. I attack the bishop with the intention of playing e5. I was expecting bishop takes knight, but that's not what he played. If that had happened, I would have recaptured with the pawn, still keeping the threat on e5. My opponent played bishop to b8. And so I push e5. And here it looks like I'm going to win a piece with the pin, but black is going to play g5. And now you have to start thinking again, knowing that this is a 5-minute game. It's a game with no increment, no added time. So you need to know what the best way to capture is. Here I didn't want to take the knight right away because I thought that after capturing the bishop, he could easily recapture the pawn on f6, and the checks wouldn't accomplish anything. The king could just move to the dark squares. Sure, I could play knight to e4 to reinforce the pawn on f6, but my opponent could even sacrifice the exchange, take the pawn on f6. It's true he'd be down the exchange, but he'd have the pair of bishops. And now I'm lacking pieces to attack his king, because if I play bishop h7 check, he just moves to a dark square. So what then? There's no follow-up in the attack on his king. So I wasn't satisfied with taking with the knight here, and I decided to capture on g5 with the following idea. If the knight moves, I play g6. I attack his queen and threaten to take on f7, forking the king and rook thanks to my rook's protection. For example, if the knight comes to d5, I had planned g6. He can take my bishop, but I take on f7, forking the king and rook afterwards. Except my opponent is going to bring the knight to g4. And this time the g6 push scares me. Now I start to get stressed because I tell myself, on g6 he's going to take the bishop, threaten mate on h2, and there are threats of a fork on e3. If I take on f7 with check, he can go to g7. There's no way I can take the rook and promote to a queen, because that would be mate. I can take the rook with a knight check, but he recaptures. This position scared me with the attack on h2, the bishop facing the king, the queen and knight attacking together, the e5 pawn about to fall, and the bishop also able to join the attack. Sure, the black king is exposed, but I don't have many pieces to check the black king, while it feels like black has a lot of pieces to attack my king with potential mating threats. So in this position, what should I do now? Because black is threatening to capture, they're threatening to come into e3. And that's when I tell myself, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm not going to play g6. I'm going to play rook takes f7, with the idea that if the king takes the rook, this time I'll have g6 check and I could capture his queen. But after rook takes f7, he doesn't take my rook, he takes the pawn. And now I look and think, now my bishop is under attack. If I retreat to g3, I'm going to lose the rook. What should I do? This is where I invite you to find the final move, the fatal move, the decisive move of the game. What would you play as white? Did you find it? The right move here is bishop to c4, and I found this move very elegant. We leave the bishop on h4 attacked by the pawn. We play bishop to c4, which is also attacked by a pawn. The idea is to defend the rook while gaining tempo so that he can't take the rook immediately, and to open up the diagonal for the queen. The bishop's departure opens up this diagonal to enter h9 and deliver mate. So if black takes the bishop, we checkmate. There's no way to avoid mate now. Even if the knight comes back to f6, we could try to take it. But we can also play queen to g6 check, and after king to h8, checkmate on g7. So I really like this final move, bishop to c4, leaving both bishops attacked by both pawns and opening up the diagonal to the black king. Now, do you want to see my defeat? I'm not facing the same opponent here. My opponent starts with d4. I play d5, he plays c4 just like in the previous game, except this time I take the c4 pawn. I go for the queen's gambit accepted. I'm well aware that I'm losing central control, but I tell myself that while white is busy recapturing the c4 pawn, I'll be able to counterattack in the center. For example, if white plays e4, which is not what my opponent did, but if white immediately plays e4 with the bishop attacking the c4 pawn, how should black respond? You have to react dynamically. You must not let white establish a strong center. And the theoretical move here is to push e5, with the idea that if white captures, we exchange queens and break their castling. And now we can play bishop to e6 to defend the pawn, or even better, knight to c6 to counterattack that pawn. And after knight to f3, for example, bishop to g4 pins the knight, threatens knight takes e5, and also sets up queenside castling with a king attack. It's a disaster for white. So as you can see, after the push to e5, it's not in white's interest to capture. They might decide to push forward and then recapture the c4 pawn. And here, you have to keep attacking. Knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn, knight to c3, and you can play b5, because if the knight takes, you'll get your revenge on the central pawn. So after e4, e5, the best move for white is often knight to f3. And after the capture on d4, white takes on c4. The d4 pawn is under attack, but more importantly, white has good development. The knight, the bishop, castling, and the central pawn. This position is possible to defend for black, but it's really not easy. It's very dangerous. This is the variation I recommend for white. But in the game, after the capture on c4, my opponent didn't play e4. He played knight to f3. That's the other main theoretical move. The idea is to fight against the e5 push. Because now white won't be forced to capture with the pawn anymore, they can capture with the knight. So I play knight to f6 to control the e4 square and to fight against the e4 push. My opponent plays e3. And here I develop the bishop to g4. Bishop takes on c4. Careful, white is threatening to take on f7 with check, followed by knight to e5, which would fork the king and the bishop, attacking the bishop twice. So you have to play e6. And my opponent is going to play knight to d2 here. There are players, a lot of players, who will play queen to b3 to attack the b7 pawn, which is no longer protected by the bishop. Here, the variation is to take the knight to break up kingside castling and not try to defend the b7 pawn. Play for development, knight to d7, and after queen takes b7, play c5. We're threatening to capture and break up white's pawn structure, creating isolated pawns, doubled isolated pawns, and another isolated pawn here. And if white takes on c5, the bishop recaptures, and we have good development with black. We've somewhat damaged the safety of the white king. The queen can sometimes also be attacked and sometimes even trapped. Castling is within reach. Sure, black is down a pawn, but they have a lot of compensation in the position. That's how I usually play this position. But here, my opponent plays knight to d2. That means he's also threatening b3. And if the bishop takes, there won't be a shattered castling position since the knight can recapture. So I play a 6. That way, if queen b3 comes, I can play b5. My opponent castles kingside, and I've always been used to playing c5 here. To attack the d4 pawn, I'll go knight to c6 afterwards and put pressure on the d4 pawn, aiming to exchange my flank pawn for the central pawn, just like white did to me by exchanging their flank pawn, the c2 pawn that moved to c4, to attack the central d5 pawn. I'm going to do to white what they did to me. And yet in this position, I don't play c5. That's always what I used to play before. But this time I decided to innovate because I saw a game by Carlsen where Carlsen doesn't play c5. He goes to attack the d4 pawn, but not with the c pawn, with the e pawn. He plays knight to c6 with the idea of playing e5. So what's the difference? It's that if we exchange the e pawn for the d pawn, black will have a queenside majority of 3 pawns against 2, which can be interesting in the endgame. White will have a central majority with the extra e pawn. But the bet here is that white won't really be able to activate their central majority and launch an attack against the black king, and that black will instead have chances to exchange pieces and enter an endgame where the queenside majority will be an asset, with the possibility of creating a distant passed pawn. So white plays bishop to e2, I play bishop to d6 to prepare the e5 push. b3, and here, I think for a long time about the e5 push, but I don't play it. I regret it now. Here I could have played e5. If white captures on e5 with the knight or the pawn, we recapture. And if the knight takes, you have to take on e2 first, because my bishop is under attack, and then recapture the knight, attack the rook, and most likely castle kingside. And we get this position where I have a clear majority of 3 pawns against 2 on the queen side. So it's true that he has an extra central pawn, but we've already exchanged 2 pairs of minor pieces, a bishop and a knight, so the offensive potential has been somewhat reduced. I think I could withstand possible attacks on my king, because here the white pieces aren't really well placed to attack my castled position, and I could rather make use of my pawn majority on the queen side. The computer thinks the position is equal with chances for both sides. But I didn't play e5 because I thought white could play bishop to b2. It's not a big deal, you can play queen to e7 in that position. And I wanted to do the opposite. Starting with kingside castling reassured me, so I castled short first. And after bishop to b2, I played queen to e7 with the intention of playing e5. Except that I lost the tempo by castling short. And now my opponent is going to deprive me of that e5 push by playing knight to e5 himself. My bishop is attacked, so I take on e2. He recaptures, and now I'm in trouble, because his knight on e5 is threatening to take my knight on c6. And if I recapture with the pawn, I ruin my pawn structure on the queen side with doubled isolated pawns and a weak c-file with vulnerabilities. So I tell myself I'm going to have to take his knight. But not with the knight, of course, because if the pawn recaptures, supported by the bishop, there's a fork. So I'll take with the bishop. The pawn recaptures, my knight is attacked, so of course I'm going to move my knight. But the problem here is that I don't understand the position. I don't realize that my king is weak and could come under attack. And so, since I don't understand that, I won't find the sharpest, most dynamic moves, the most decisive responses to prevent him from attacking my king. I'll play rather calmly and I'll end up with problems. In the position, I played knight to d5. I'll explain to you what I'm trying to do and why I don't understand the position. Here I tell myself, my opponent has a bad dark squared bishop, it's blocked by the pawn on e5. I'm going to leave the dark squared bishop trapped behind the pawn on e5, and I'll play on the light squares. Because my opponent obviously has one less piece to play on the light squares. How do I play on the light squares? It's not easy, he doesn't have many weaknesses, but I see that the d3 and c2 squares are weak, meaning they're not defended by pawns. And I tell myself, I'm going to play knight to b4 with a rook on d8 to try to get my knight into d3. That will allow me to attack the bishop. That will allow me to double up the attacks on the pawn on e5. That could be interesting. So ideas like rook to d8, knight to b4. We put pressure on the pawn on a2 so that the rook can't move too easily, then get into d3 or look for entries on e2 depending on the circumstances. But what I don't realize here is that my king is weak and is going to get attacked. How is it going to get attacked? There will be the push to f4. With the rook's path cleared, the white knight will come to e4, the rook can come to f3 or g3, and the queen can also come to g4 or h5. And in the end, there will be three pieces against my king: the queen, the rook, and the knight. The pawn on e5 will remain as my space and my defensive possibilities. On top of that, my knight can't come back to f6 because of that pawn. But my f-pawn can't advance too much either, because if there are captures, it will also open up his dark squared bishop. And that I don't understand. I'm going to have a defensive problem. He didn't play f4 right away. He played knight to e4 first. I play rook to d8, still with the intention of playing knight to b4, knight to d3. f4 is played, knight to b4. And here my opponent makes a mistake. He should have played rook to f3, bringing his rooks into the attack. And for example, after knight to d3, bringing the rook to g3, knight takes bishop, and look at the attack, queen to h5. Impossible to defend. Even though I won the bishop on b2, I can't defend this position. What are the threats? White threatens knight to f6 check thanks to the pin on the g-pawn, and then the h7 pawn will fall, leading to a decisive attack. If I play g6, there will still be knight to f6 check, then the capture on h7. If I play h6, there will be queen takes h6. If I move my king to prevent knight to f6 from coming with check, there will be knight to g5. Threatening queen takes h7 mate, and if h6, then knight takes f7, the queen covers it, so the attack is just too strong. In this position, my opponent should have played rook to f3, brought the rook to g3, then queen to g4 or queen to h5, and coordinated the attack on the king side with the rook, queen, and knight. But he plays f5. He makes a mistake. I take on f5. He recaptures with the rook, and I establish myself on the white square d3, just as I intended, to attack the base of the black squares and triple the pressure on the pawn at e5. On top of that, behind it, there's the weakness of the pawn on e4 and the pawn on e3. There are a lot of weaknesses on the e-file, and that's when he plays a move that surprised me. I wasn't prepared for it at all. He plays knight to f6 check. Actually, it's a mistake. But I won't manage to defend the position. I take. He recaptures. He sacrificed the piece, but now there's this pawn on f6. It's the dragon's tooth. You know, a pawn on the 6th rank right next to the king, I call that a dragon's tooth. It's so dangerous. My queen is under attack. I move to e4, attacking his rook, defending the knight. Rook to g5 check, I go to h8. And now my queen defends h7. She defends the knight. She's well positioned defensively. And my opponent is very precise. He's going to play rook to g4 to unsettle my queen. I don't want to go to f5 because then there would be rook to f1. That would allow another piece to join the attack. So I retreat to e6. He saves his bishop by moving to c3. And here I make a blunder. I make a mistake. I'm so worried about my king that I play rook to g8. But that simply allows white to exchange rooks and then win the knight on d3. I forgot that my rook on d8 was protecting my knight, quite simply. It would have been better if I had, for example, brought my knight back to e5 for defense. So rook to g8, that's the blunder. But my opponent doesn't take advantage of it right away. He could have taken the rook and then captured the knight, but instead he plays rook to g7. Rook to g7 isn't the best move for him. In fact, it's a losing move because I could keep the advantages in the position, if only I could find the right move. It's not obvious and I didn't find it. Will you be able to find it? I invite you to pause the video and think about what you would do as black in this position. So what did you come up with? Do you understand? The white threat is terrible. White threatens rook takes h7, and after king takes queen to a5, checkmate. So if I try to move my knight, I lose. Rook takes h7, check, king takes, queen to a5, checkmate. So that's not possible. Taking the rook is what I did, but that's losing as well. The right move is to play the queen to e4, not queen to f5 because of rook to f1. Queen to e4 because I come back to protect the knight, which the white queen could always try to capture. And I protect h7 to avoid sacrifices that would lead to mate. So queen to e4 is the right move. But in this position, it's very uncomfortable to have the rook here, the pawn, the bishop. If I started to capture, he recaptures with check, of course. King to g8 and he takes back the knight. I play rook to e8 to attack the pawn on e3. He defends with rook to e1, and here I look for a queen exchange with queen to e4. That is certainly a bad idea. I should have played knight to e5. But in this position, I'm so worried about my king with that g7 pawn protected by the bishop that I go for the queen exchange. Queen takes, rook takes, the king comes to protect the pawn, and then I play knight to d8 to come back to e6 and attack the g7 pawn. Knight to d8. But my opponent takes control of the d-file. Knight to e6. I thought the knight was well placed because it's attacking g7. It controls the d8 square to prevent mates, and it protects the c7 pawn. But it's just overloaded with work. Rook to d7 comes, and I can no longer go take the g7 pawn like I wanted because I would lose the c7 pawn. You see what the plan is on the 7th rank. Rook to d8 doesn't work. The rook and the knight can come back to defend, but rook takes c7, and now the white rook is cleaning up my position by attacking b7, and I risk losing all my pawns. So after rook to d7, I play rook to g4. I tell myself I'll try to play rook to g5, come back to c5, attack the bishop, defend my pawn, and then look for rook to c2 to attack on the 2nd rank. My opponent plays bishop to f6. He prevents me from using the g5 square. I play rook to g6, he plays bishop to b2. I go back to g5 for this idea of rook to c5. But now rook to e7. And here, it's terrible. It threatens rook to e8, mate. So I'm forced to eliminate the g7 pawn. And rook takes c7 threatens rook to c8, knight to h8. Rook takes h8 mate, and also threatens to take the b7 pawn. And now it's terrible because I realize I'm losing my pawns one by one, and that the endgame I can't save it anymore. So I play h5 to give my king an escape square, but rook takes b7. At this point I probably should have played rook to c5 to counterattack on the 2nd rank, but I had lost all clarity. I didn't have much time left, and the problem was that I had already accepted my defeat. In my mind, I knew I wouldn't make it anymore. He's 2 pawns up, has a bishop that's better than my knight, and a rook that's better than mine. I don't believe in the position anymore. I play knight to e6 to try to get my knight a bit more active. The closer my knight gets, the more chances it might have for a fork. Rook to b6 attacks the pawn, so I play rook to f5 check. I should have gone to c5 to always counterattack on c2, you know. King to e2, a5, bishop to c3. He attacks. Here I play a4. I tell myself, if I'm going to lose this pawn, I might as well double white's pawns. But white plays b4, they counter push and go after the a-pawn to get 2 connected passed pawns. I play knight to g5. I'm aiming to play knight to e4, to attack the bishop, to get into f2. But it just doesn't work, plain and simple. rook to a6, knight to e4, bishop to e1. He saves his bishop, controls f2, and I resign in this position because honestly, I don't have much time left, and the position just can't be saved anymore. He's going to take the pawn on a4. He'll have 2 pawns. Actually, he has 3 extra pawns, but it's mainly those 2 connected passed pawns that will work together as they advance toward promotion. I'll have to sacrifice a piece, maybe even both, to stop him from queening, and the endgame is completely lost. And you see, thinking back on it, I regret not having played e5 right away. That was my idea. I preferred to castle kingside and then, after bishop to b2, play queen to e7 to prepare the e5 push. But then knight to e5 happened, and at that point, I didn't understand the position. You see, I took on e2, then I took his knight because it was hard to tolerate, especially since he was also threatening to take my knight on c6. So I take his knight, pawn takes, but now my knight is under attack and I don't see the ideas behind f4. Rook to f3, rook to g3, knight to e4, all the attacks that are about to come. Well, I hope you found this video interesting with this new series. 1 win, 1 loss. And we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. You can leave me likes, comments, share the video, and support the channel. See you soon.